presenting a new exciting radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an amazing and incredible personality. Faster than an airplane, more powerful than a locomotive, impervious to bullets.
Up in the sky, look!
It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman!
How many characters do you know that once had a radio show in the 40s and also have a new movie in 2025? For a long time now, audiences have been growing tired of the same superhero formula. The term superhero fatigue gets tossed around more and more with each new release, and audiences are clamoring for something new. Something actually new, not just the same formula with different characters. So when James Gunn announced that he was working on a new Superman film, I was a bit confused. James Gunn is one of the few people working on superhero projects that understands that the genre is going to fail, but also seems to have some ideas on how to fix it. Despite the continuing downslide of MCU projects and the complete failure of the DCEU, the projects that Gunn is attached to still gain a lot of attention and popularity, so he's clearly doing something right. But my confusion comes from Superman. Now, I'm aware that he's quite a popular character, but when Gunn announced a new Superman project, my first thought was, again? Because we've tried this before, more than once, and I didn't really see how another Superman movie could change things up when he's literally the poster child for superheroes as a whole. But then I watched the movie. And holy shit, it's actually surprisingly inventive in its storytelling, and it ended up being so much better than I thought it would be. Everything about the movie just felt like a new direction, and made me feel excitement for the superhero genre for the first time in years. But will this actually be enough to save it? The superhero genre has been around for decades, but became particularly popular during the early 2000s. I hesitate to attribute that popularity to any one movie or franchise because I think that mostly depends on your own opinion. Did it start in 2000 with the X-Men, or 2002 with Spider-Man, or 2005 with Batman Begins? Take your pick, and let me know in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. Regardless of where and when it started, superhero movies have evolved further than anyone expected them to. The problem is, that evolution has mostly been limited to the scale of these movies. The presentation, storytelling, and even some of the characters have more or less stayed the same this entire time. It was fun at first. When Spider-Man first came out, there weren't actually a whole lot of origin stories being made, so making an entire movie about how Spider-Man became Spider-Man was actually a refreshing idea. Even the MCU in the beginning was something completely new and exciting. The idea of a cinematic universe just didn't really exist before the MCU. Sure, you had movies that were connected to each other, either because they were sequels or because there were Easter eggs connecting them, but the idea of a bunch of separate, self-contained movies growing together into something bigger wasn't something anybody had done before. But after 25 years of this, it's become pretty stale. The once revolutionary idea to make an origin story just became another part of the same formula. Reluctant heroes, powerful villains, sometimes with the exact same powers as the hero, and climactic battles full of underbaked CGI have all become synonymous with the superhero genre. It's just the same things in each and every new movie, and it doesn't just make them boring, it kind of makes them meaningless too. How many times have we seen cities being destroyed, or heroes losing their powers, or Charles Xavier dying? And every time it happens, we know it doesn't really mean anything because no matter what happens, everything will go back to the way it was eventually. Many fans and critics have voiced their disdain for this trend. One of the biggest detractors of superhero movies has been Martin Scorsese, who famously compared the MCU to a theme park. The movies give plenty of spectacle and excitement, but nothing of substance and no real emotional depth. Some people find this take as out of touch, while others find it incredibly accurate. But regardless of how you feel about the statements, there can really be no question that most superhero movies are made to maximize excitement while taking as few risks as possible. When it comes to James Gunn's Superman, and even the new DCU so far, I'd say it's even more exciting than most of the recent superhero projects that we've gotten, and it takes a whole lot of risks doing it. There are so many elements in Superman that I couldn't imagine Marvel ever doing with their projects, and laying the groundwork of this new DCU with projects like Peacemaker and Creature Commandos really shows that Gunn isn't trying to copy the MCU, which is wonderful because, let's be honest, the MCU has introduced a lot of problems into the genre. Before we continue, just so we're all prepared for it, I will be going into some spoilers for the new Superman movie that just came out. I'll try to avoid any big spoilers, but whenever I talk about specifics from the movie, you'll see this on screen. When it comes to making movies and shows, Disney's model has always been to find a formula that works and repeat it for everything. This by itself isn't really an issue, since just about every story follows a formula of some kind. I'm sure most of you have heard of the hero's journey by now. The difference here is that it's not just the story structure that they're reusing, it's everything else too. It almost seems like Disney believes that the only way to get people to watch Marvel movies is if they make them all as similar as possible. While this works in making everything feel like it's all a part of the same world, it also tends to make the MCU feel a little less genuine. From movie to movie and show to show, the tone and style has always stayed pretty much the same, with some exceptions that we'll get into later. In their quest to make the Marvel formula, they stripped most of their projects of any unique personality that they could have had. One of the biggest reasons people enjoy projects from certain creators is because of the specific style that creator brings to each of their projects. But Marvel's formula has made it so most of their projects feel like they could have been made by any random director out there. What's odd is that they did allow some directors to take their projects in different directions, with one of the most consistent being James Gunn with Guardians of the Galaxy. But after the Avengers came out, there was a very distinct style being applied to just about every new project after it. One of the biggest complaints about the Marvel formula is the quips. Ever since Joss Whedon directed the Avengers, the overall writing style in most MCU movies has tried to reflect Whedon's. If you're not sure what I mean by this, well...
Nothing harmful, low levels of gamma radiation.
That can be harmful.
I'm in the middle of an interrogation. This moron is giving me everything.
I don't give everything.
It's an honor to meet you. I watched you while you were sleeping.
You listen well, brother.
I'm listening. I don't think So that's what it does.
Now, if you like his style of humor, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem with it being so persistent is that it creates sort of a disconnect. Serious, emotional moments are undercut for a quick joke. Now, of course, it doesn't do this for every serious moment, but it does make the emotions seem a bit less sincere. It almost feels as though Marvel is saying, okay, we don't need to care about this part very much, so make it funny. But then we want this part to seem important, so no jokes. Now let's compare this to Superman. Firstly, there aren't a whole lot of emotional scenes in the movie, but there is still a lot of emotional moments. I know that sounds weird, but hear me out. In most movies, you've got death scenes, breakup scenes, just a whole bunch of specific scenes that writers can use that stand out specifically to create emotional moments. There's nothing wrong with that, these scenes exist in thousands of movies, and it's just a good way to give these events the gravity that they need. But I bring it up because, like I said, Superman doesn't really have these. There aren't really many scenes in the movie that exist only to give emotional weight, but there's still plenty of moments that have so much emotional depth to them. The way the movie goes about this is by contrasting Superman's ideals against basically the rest of the world. Superman in this movie is naive and makes a lot of questionable decisions, but the only reason he makes those decisions is because of how easily he trusts people, and that his only goal is to help people who need him. One of the central events this movie revolves around is something that happens before the start of the movie. Superman stops the country of Baravia from invading the country of Jarhanpur. Politically speaking, this is a minefield, just trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. Because while Superman did stop a war, it brings up the question of how much oversight superheroes should have over the world. But Superman doesn't see it this way. Being a reporter, he knows that the Baravian president is just trying to expand his country by taking over another one. And he gets genuinely upset when people try to suggest that he was in the wrong. Not because he wants to have that power, but because he legitimately doesn't see how saving lives can ever be wrong. Superman has such a sincerity to it that we don't really see in other superhero movies. The majority of the emotional moments simply come from the fact that Superman wants to do good and be a good person, and no one believes him. That sincerity is even reflected in the style of the movie. Most superhero movies we see take place in a semi-realistic world, even the MCU. Remember, when Iron Man came out, there weren't any other active heroes in the world at that point. It was basically our world, and Iron Man existed in it. But superheroes in comic books have always been ridiculous and kind of stupid, and Superman has no problem embracing that. We've got aliens casually existing on Earth, the Green Lanterns seem to be public knowledge, the Justice Gang has been fighting crime for years, and Superman has comic-accurate hypno glasses to hide his identity. Which is funny because this is also one of the only times it makes sense for people not to connect Clark Kent to Superman, because they actually look different. This version of Superman is so unapologetic about being a comic book movie. There are so many ridiculous ideas in this movie that could have tanked it if they were just played for jokes, but they weren't. This world just exists, and it has such a unique identity. Speaking of... Before we begin this section, it's important to note that Superman isn't the first entry into James Gunn's DCU. I think technically the first movie is the Suicide Squad, not that one. And like I said earlier, there's also Peacemaker and Creature Commandos, which are shows on HBO. Now I haven't seen Peacemaker yet, but I have seen Suicide Squad and Creature Commandos, and they are both very good. I'd recommend them if you haven't seen them yet. But do you know what these projects have in common with Superman? Not much. Obviously they're a part of the same universe, so they share that, and they share some of the same characters, but other than that, each project in the DCU so far has been pretty distinct in terms of their tone and visual styles. Suicide Squad is very much comedic, but it's also very gritty and graphic in a lot of ways, whereas Superman is very bright and colorful and hopeful in a way. It'd be difficult to imagine a version of Suicide Squad being made in the style of Superman, and making Superman in the style of Suicide Squad would have changed the entire movie. Even when you compare Suicide Squad, Peacemaker, and Creature Commandos, it's still very clear that they all have their own tones and styles. Granted, they're all violent shows that don't shy away from graphic details, but even so, if I showed you a screenshot from each product, you'd be able to tell that they're from completely different shows. It keeps things fun and interesting, and helps to set the tone for each new project when they come out. When you watch Superman, it doesn't just feel like the next DCU movie, it feels like Superman. This distinction between projects is something the MCU has struggled with for a long time. The majority of MCU movies are indistinguishable from each other, both in visual style and tone, and it can make the movies feel like they're blending together. It's not the case with every single MCU project. There are quite a few shows and movies that have their own distinct personality and do try to stand out. WandaVision, for instance, switches to a new visual style for almost every episode, changing it to match different styles of sitcoms, before unfortunately reverting back to the standard MCU tone for the closing episodes. Part of the problem is that studios will usually treat superhero movie as its own genre, which is really weird because some of the most beloved superhero movies have mixed in other genres to keep them interesting. Captain America: Winter Soldier was one of the most popular entries into the MCU because they made it into a political spy thriller. Logan is my personal favorite X-Men movie, and it's largely because the style and tone mirror a lot of traits from old Western movies. I'm not even a big fan of Westerns, it just feels so unique. Thankfully, it seems like the studios are actually starting to pay attention to this trend, because they're experimenting more and more with different genres. The Batman was an amazing Batman movie because they kept it so grounded, and it ended up feeling like a noir detective movie. Joker doesn't even feel like a comic book movie, even though it literally has Bruce Wayne in it. The best way to make a superhero movie is just to make a good movie that happens to have superheroes in it. Marvel may be trying to shift to this idea as well. Fantastic Four looks like it might be something new and different for the MCU, but only time will tell. Personally, my guess is that after Fantastic Four, they'll just go back to the same style as the rest of their projects. The lack of individual identity hints at something that's always persisted in the superhero genre, and has been the cause of many of the issues that continue to this day. We've talked a bit about studio interference before on this channel, and the MCU is a pretty good example of why it's a problem. Studio executives know what makes money, I won't deny that. The MCU has been one of the most consistent moneymakers in Hollywood, but when you're making money from entertainment, eventually your guaranteed hit will fail, every time. The idea that you can have one formula and repeat it for every movie you make is ridiculous, because eventually people will want something else. We saw it with Westerns. They were everywhere, from the 40s all the way up to the 70s, but eventually audiences started thinking, why would I watch this Western when it's pretty much the same as the ones from 20 years ago? This is where actual creators come in. People who aren't just focused on what makes the most money, but instead focus on what will entertain audiences. Directors and actors are supposed to be able to take the characters and the story and interpret them in different ways, bringing different perspectives into a project. But in a lot of superhero projects, those creators are shut out by the producers. Sometimes things work out fine, but quite often it instead leads to things like Suicide Squad, yes that one, Justice League, and Quantumania. Now I'm sure these movies have fans out there somewhere, but they also have a lot of objective problems with them. Suicide Squad's story was an absolute mess because the producers made a mess of it during editing. The production of Justice League was so rushed that we ended up with that, and what do we even say about Quantumania? I think we've all seen MODOK by now. The worst part about all these movies is that they probably all started as decent ideas, but were taken over by studio execs who didn't want to trust the creators. When Suicide Squad released in theaters, the director, David Ayer, was quick to dismiss the film because of how bad the final edit was. Ayer had made his own cut of the film, and people who have seen it have said it's actually good, but the studio went with their own version that was initially edited by a trailer editing studio and updated with reshoots for the final cut. If Ayer was allowed more control during editing, it's possible that Suicide Squad wouldn't have failed so spectacularly. But the studio wanted something big and loud and exciting, and they sacrificed the characters and the story to do it. Earlier I brought up Martin Scorsese comparing superhero movies to theme parks. This kind of a comparison isn't a criticism about the movies themselves, but rather an indictment on studio overreach. There's nothing inherently wrong with liking these movies, and if you do enjoy them, that's wonderful. The problem resides in the fact that just about every choice made on these movies is determined by the producers, not the creators, and the producers are willing to sacrifice the quality of the entire project if they think they have an idea that'll make more money. We've even reached a point where studios will just put actors in front of the green screen, give them a one-page script, and say, okay, now just pretend you're talking to Iron Man. That's not creativity, that's puppetry. With the new DCU, however, it seems like things are going in a different direction. There's already multiple shows and movies in this new cinematic universe, and all of them feel very distinct, almost as if there have been unique creative visions for each project. Yes, all these projects are technically still being run by a producer, since James Gunn has had a hand in all of them. The difference is, Gunn seems to be aware of the importance of trusting the creators working on these projects, collaborating with them to make something people will enjoy. We see this done really well in Superman. Even though Gunn is the writer and director, we also get to see the actors creating their characters, giving them personality, and making them feel alive. I'm gonna say something that I think will upset some people, but it's true. Actors have gotten so lazy. A lot of actors have pretty much stopped acting altogether and now just play themselves in different costumes, or the entire cast of a movie just plays all their characters with basically the same personality. Superman has so many characters in it who have so much more personality to them than anybody in the MCU, or even the former DCEU. Even Lex Luthor is more than just a basic villain. He shows hints at some kind of sentimentality by keeping a picture of Mr. Handsome on his desk, who James Gunn revealed to be the result of the first time Lex tried to create an artificial human being when he was a kid. That's a real thing. Lex Luthor made this human as a kid. He kind of reminds me of the Greendale human being. Which brings us to something that the DCU is really excelling at. We've talked a lot about the MCU so far, but honestly, in terms of their world building, they're doing mostly okay. Mostly. Really, the biggest problem with the MCU's world building is somewhat of a lack of commitment. For instance, in Endgame, we see the Earth-based characters and the space-based characters talking to each other in what seems to be a regular meeting. But then in every movie after that, the Earth characters and space characters seem to be pretty much separate again, even though they had regular meetings for presumably years during the blip. That's just one example of what I mean, there are plenty more, so let's chat about it below. But like I said, I think the MCU's world building is fine. The better example to compare to in this case is actually the DCEU. From the beginning of the DCEU, it was always obvious that they were just trying to catch up to the MCU, and their way of doing that was basically to copy the MCU format, but cut a lot more corners. This led to a pretty big inconsistency, where Man of Steel, the first movie in the DCEU, introduced Superman in a world where metahumans and aliens don't exist, only to reveal that in Batman v Superman, the second movie in the DCEU, that superheroes and metahumans do exist, and have for a long time. Now you probably want to point out that this is the same thing that the MCU did when they introduced Iron Man, which is mostly true, but also at the end of Iron Man, Nick Fury shows up and at least hints that there are more heroes like him, but S.H.I.E.L.D. has kept them a secret. In Man of Steel, there's no real hints that other metahumans exist, and there's not even an organization that could have kept them a secret. More to the point though, the decision to do that in Iron Man was made out of necessity. Superhero movies still weren't very big when that movie came out, so it would have been a massive risk to set up the entire world in the first movie. But by the time Man of Steel came out, the MCU was a proven success. Phase 1 had finished by then, and people clearly wanted more, so DC could have used that as an opportunity to create a world where superheroes already exist. Marvel did the heavy lifting and proved that the cinematic universe works, but one of the reasons the DCEU failed is because they clearly thought they had to do the same things that Marvel did in order to be successful. This is where the DCU proves to be a massive improvement. The very first line in Superman is a line of text that says, 3 centuries ago, the first metahumans appeared. It's simple, but just that alone is exciting to hear. We're not seeing how a world like ours might change if superheroes existed. We're seeing a completely different world where superheroes have existed for 300 years. It makes this new cinematic universe feel like it just exists, and we get to look at it through a window. There's a history. Most of the characters we're introduced to have been trying to accomplish their goals for years now, and even the characters themselves feel a little more real. One of the problems that I personally had with the DCEU was just the characters. Most of them felt like they existed just for the movie that they were in, and before that, they didn't exist. There were attempts to make some of them more complicated, but even that usually fell flat. Be honest, how many of you remember that this Batman used to have a Robin? There's been a recent trend in movies to make characters more complicated by giving them some kind of justification for what they do, and to make them more sympathetic and relatable. We've seen it with characters like Killmonger and Thanos in the MCU, and plenty of franchises have done the same thing at this point. The thing that most studios don't seem to understand though is that there's a difference between complicated and sympathetic. Complicated characters don't have to have some deep reason for why they want to accomplish their goals. They can still be complicated and deep characters while simply wanting to do something just because they want to. I think one of the worst victims of this is Lex Luthor in the DCEU. Now, we all know Lex's deal. He wants to kill Superman. As far as I'm aware, that's always been true for him. But in the DCEU, Zack Snyder decided that he needed a reason, and that reason was because his father was abusive towards him. This was fine. There's nothing really wrong with it, but it kind of feels out of place. When they meet in Batman v Superman, it's literally the first time they ever meet, which means that Lex sees Superman on TV, a guy he's never met, who has nothing to do with him, and he decides that guy is going to die for what my dad did to me. And I'm aware that it's more about what Superman represents, since he's seen as an all-powerful hero who will save everyone, but even that doesn't really feel right. This superhero can't actually save everyone, so I will kill him because of it. The thing about Lex Luthor is that he's one of those villains that just shouldn't really be sympathetic. He's a racist billionaire who wants to kill Superman just because he's an alien. He doesn't need daddy issues to be interesting. This is where the new Lex Luthor comes in. His motivation is killing Superman. Everything he does is specifically to kill Superman. The thing that makes him complicated in this movie is not that his motivation is justified by anything, it's showing just how far he's willing to go to accomplish this goal. Because he can't just kill Superman. He's the most beloved superhero in the world. So his plan isn't just kill Superman, his plan is to get the government to ask him to kill Superman. Even Superman's motivation is simple. He wants to do good. He just wants to be a good person. A simple motivation doesn't mean the character is simple. You can get a lot of complexity just from the phrase good person. Zack Snyder's Superman tends to focus a lot more on trying to find his purpose, which is very relatable, but it doesn't automatically make him an interesting character. This Superman just wants to be a good person, and the movie actually tries to explore what happens when people disagree with him about what good means. Now before we move on to the next part, I do want to say that despite all the reasons to dislike the DCEU as a whole, I will always love Batman v Superman just for giving us this introduction. Say what you want about the movie or about Gal Gadot, but you've got to admit that that is the hardest superhero entrance ever. Anyway, that brings us to the big question. Can There's been a lot of talk about superhero fatigue, especially with seemingly every new MCU movie failing to live up to expectations. People are tired of seeing the same things in every superhero movie, and pretty soon, the Marvel logo won't be enough to get people to watch anymore. Is Superman enough to change that? Yes and no. There are a lot of elements to Superman that really make it stand out and feel different. The setting feels completely unique, the characters feel like they've existed for years before the movie starts, and the tone feels entirely unique to Superman. I can't imagine a Batman or a Wonder Woman movie looking like this. But at the end of the day, it is still another superhero movie, and it still has a lot of the same hallmarks of other superhero movies, like having a villain with the exact same powers and bringing in a world-ending threat at the end. That's not to say that those are automatically bad, but just that they're also very big complaints that people have had about superhero movies. It's important to remember though that this isn't the first time the superhero genre has seen big changes. I talked earlier about movies like Logan and The Batman, which integrated other genres in such a way that they felt entirely different to anything we've seen so far. Movies where it feels like the focus was on making a good movie before making it a superhero movie. I'd go as far as to say if you didn't know anything about the X-Men or Wolverine, you wouldn't even realize that Logan is a superhero movie. To really save the superhero genre, I'd say we need a combination of these ideas. Show us a unique world with characters who have lived their lives by the time we meet them, but also don't be afraid to put superheroes in something other than a superhero movie. Much like westerns before it, superhero movies need to evolve in order to stay alive. So while it's not the only answer to saving superhero movies, Superman at the very least stands out as something that can actually get people excited for the future of superheroes.